Welcome to the Global Risk Podcast from Solace Global. This is your weekly global intelligence briefing, covering the key geopolitical and security developments shaping the world. In the Americas, we examine escalating violence along Guatemala's western border amid turf wars between local gangs and Mexican cartels. The unresolved Honduran presidential election, where allegations of irregularities and foreign interference have increased the likelihood of unrest, and the announcement of a de facto U.S. blockade on Venezuelan oil exports, marking a new phase in Washington's pressure campaign against President Maduro. Across Europe, the Middle East, and Africa, we assess disrupted terror plots targeting Christmas markets in Germany and Poland. The latest Ukraine peace negotiations focused on security guarantees and territorial concessions, mass anti-corruption protests in Romania, and a rare ISIS attack that killed U.S. personnel in Syria. And in Asia-Pacific, we cover the escalating clashes between Thailand and Cambodia, where civilian areas have been targeted, and the deadly terrorist attack at a Hanukkah celebration in Sydney's Bondi beach. Expert insight, clear analysis, and the context you need, all in one concise briefing. We begin in the Americas, where Guatemala has declared a state of emergency in its western border regions following coordinated armed attacks on security forces. On December 14th, President Bernardo Arévalo de León announced a 15-day state of emergency in two municipalities in western Guatemala, Nahuala and Santa Catarina, Ixtahuacan, in the department of Sololá. The declaration follows a series of coordinated attacks in which armed men, dressed in military uniforms and wearing helmets and bulletproof vests, targeted an army post and a police station. The attackers were reportedly carrying high-caliber firearms. They also cut off several roads and hijacked numerous buses, killing at least 5 people. According to President Arévalo, the violence has deliberately targeted security forces, with the aim of forcing them to withdraw from the region so the attackers can expand their territorial control. The state of emergency will limit the freedom to hold open-air meetings or public demonstrations, and it will also restrict the right to carry weapons. This follows an announcement on December 9th that Guatemalan security forces would conduct joint security operations along the shared border with Mexico. The move came after what Guatemala's Ministry of Defense described as unidentified illegal armed groups entered the country and attacked several soldiers. Now, our intelligence team's assessment. Extortion has become one of the country's most pervasive criminal markets, with cases rising sharply since 2023. The food industry has been particularly heavily targeted. These operations are largely orchestrated by organized gangs, including Mara Salvatrucha, or MS-13, and Barrio 18, alongside smaller local groups. Guatemala is both a transit and destination country for arms trafficking, and it has one of the highest violent crime rates in Latin America. Much of the recent violence has been driven by turf wars between Guatemalan gangs and Mexican cartels along the border. In particular, the new generation Jalisco cartel and the Sinaloa cartel have been seeking to expand their control over drug, arms, and human trafficking routes in the region since 2021. On December 8th, a Sinaloa cartel cell clashed with local Guatemalan gangs in the departments of Huehuetenango and San Marcos. Violence has been especially acute since June 2025, as Guatemalan criminal groups have waged an escalating conflict with an increasingly fragmented Sinaloa cartel. This escalation is likely linked to a June incursion by the Pacales, an elite police unit from the Mexican state of Chiapas. That operation disrupted local criminal control and killed several gang members, including Abdalmea Calderon Carrillo, the leader of the cartel Chiapas Guatemala. The disruption appears to have created an opening for other Mexican cartels to expand their influence. This is Guatemala's first state of emergency in response to gang violence. However, it follows a pattern seen in other countries, including El Salvador, Honduras, Trinidad and Tobago, Peru, and Ecuador, which have used states of emergency to mobilize militarized responses against gangs responsible for escalating violence. These measures have often involved mass incarceration campaigns and bans on public gatherings. The results have been mixed. El Salvador has seen significant success, with homicide rates falling dramatically. Across Latin America more broadly, however, securitized strategies have produced uneven outcomes, frequently failing to address underlying issues such as poverty, limited access to education and employment, or the reintegration of former gang members into society. Ecuador offers a clear example. There, a militarized state response has fragmented criminal groups and intensified turf wars, pushing homicide rates higher. If Guatemalan security forces pursue a similarly severe crackdown in western regions, there is a realistic risk that it could trigger an escalation in violence as gangs splinter. Staying in the region, we move to Honduras, where delays to the presidential election recount have heightened the risk of post-election unrest. The Honduran presidential election, held on November 30th, has yet to be formally resolved, and a partial vote recount is still underway. The preliminary tally indicates that the Conservative National Party candidate Nasri Asfoura, who was publicly endorsed by US President Donald Trump, holds a narrow lead of roughly 40,000 votes over the centrist Liberal Party candidate Salvador Nasrallah. A special manual recount of around 15% of tally sheets flagged for inconsistencies is scheduled, but it has yet to begin because protests are blocking access to the electoral facilities. Now, our assessment. There is a realistic possibility that the 15% of tally sheets set for recount, representing hundreds of thousands of ballots, could still sway the election in favor of either of the two remaining presidential candidates. However, supporters of all three major parties have questioned aspects of the electoral process, and the final result will almost certainly be contested. The centrist and left-wing parties have also denounced foreign interference following President Trump's endorsement of Asfoura. That sentiment has likely been amplified by the U.S. State Department's demand on December 17th for the Honduras National Electoral Council to begin the recount immediately. Honduras has a long history of post-election unrest, and the combination of alleged voting irregularities, the closeness of the presidential race, and accusations of foreign interference has almost certainly increased the risk of renewed instability. Large protests have so far been reported outside the main electoral facilities, as well as in Tegucigalpa and San Pedro Sula. However, there is a realistic possibility that once the final results are formally announced, large-scale and potentially violent demonstrations could grow in size and spread more widely. This would raise the risk of roadblocks and broader disruption, particularly in urban centers and along key transport corridors. And finally, in the Americas, the United States has announced enforcement measures that amount to a de facto blockade on Venezuelan oil exports, following the December 10th seizure of the oil tanker Skipper by U.S. forces in the Caribbean Sea. President Donald Trump declared on December 16th that all sanctioned Venezuelan oil tankers would be treated as subject to U.S. enforcement action. This move has widely been interpreted as a de facto blockade on Venezuelan crude and refined product exports, and it follows expanded sanctions targeting Venezuela-linked vessels and shipping companies. Tanker traffic in and out of Venezuela had already slowed to a near standstill following the seizure of the Skipper, with multiple vessel operators avoiding the area entirely. It is currently estimated that around 11 million barrels of crude oil and fuel are now stranded in Venezuelan waters, as ship owners, charterers, and insurers reassess the growing risk of seizure. So far, only tankers chartered by the U.S. oil company Chevron have left Venezuelan ports and sailed into international waters. President Maduro has denounced the de facto blockade as warmongering. To support military operations in the Caribbean region, the United States has expanded its military logistics and intelligence capabilities there. Trinidad and Tobago has opened its airports to U.S. aircraft, extending U.S. reach and strengthening logistics, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance coverage, as well as interdiction capability across the region. However, increased U.S. military activity has likely heightened safety risks for civilian aviation. On December 12th, a JetBlue commercial aircraft operating a New York-Curaçao route was forced to take evasive action during its ascent to avoid a mid-air collision with a U.S. Air Force aircraft flying without an active transponder. The following day, a private business jet reported a near miss with a U.S. military airframe while flying from Aruba to Miami. Now, our team's assessment. The U.S. has now engaged in months of aggressive rhetoric, posturing, and significant shaping activity since August. This has included designating Venezuelan-linked actors and networks as foreign terrorist organizations, deploying a U.S. carrier strike group to the wider region, and maintaining sustained messaging about potential military operations in Venezuela. However, it is highly likely that the U.S. has now shifted to a secondary phase of operations that prioritizes economic coercion through the interdiction of oil exports. This transition enables Washington to apply greater pressure on Maduro to step down and will likely further isolate the regime from both its internal and external backers, with Russia and China currently offering only limited financial and diplomatic support. This long-term strategy is almost certainly aimed at forcing Maduro to relinquish power without committing to direct state-on-state military conflict, by degrading the regime's primary source of revenue. However, for the U.S. to maintain a de facto blockade of Venezuela while simultaneously sustaining operations against vessels trafficking narcotics, it will likely require a significant uplift in deployed military assets and a higher tempo of maritime and air operations across the Caribbean region. As the U.S. conducts an increasing volume of operations in the region, and does so in a progressively less overt manner, such as flying military aircraft without active transponders, the risk of miscalculation and escalation will likely rise significantly. Moreover, as demonstrated by the two recent near-miss incidents, expanded U.S. air operations in the area will likely increase the risk to commercial and business aviation across Aruba, Curaçao, Trinidad and Tobago, and the Lesser Antilles. Now turning to Europe, the Middle East and Africa, where authorities in Germany and Poland have disrupted suspected terror plots targeting Christmas markets during the festive period. On December 14th, German police arrested 5 individuals in Bavaria suspected of plotting an attack on a Christmas market. The exact market has not been disclosed, but the authorities stated that the suspects were motivated by a radical Islamist ideology and intended to use a vehicle to ram into crowds of civilians. Those arrested include 1 Egyptian national, 1 Syrian, and 3 Moroccans. The Egyptian national, who was reportedly an imam at a local mosque, is suspected of having played a leading role in encouraging or coordinating the plot. In neighboring Poland, a 19-year-old Polish student from the Catholic University of Lublin was arrested on December 16th after the security services thwarted a similar plot targeting Christmas markets. The suspect had allegedly sought contact with members of Islamic State and intended to use explosives to carry out an attack, and had also planned to join the organization. The authorities have not disclosed which city was being targeted in order to avoid causing panic, but they have conducted searches in both Łódź and Lublin provinces, seizing data storage devices and other items that may serve as evidence. Now our intelligence assessment. Germany has been on high alert to protect Christmas markets from terrorism since the start of the festive season. These markets have likely become symbolic targets following the Berlin attack in 2016 and the Magdeburg attack in 2024, with the ongoing trial of the Magdeburg attacker potentially reinforcing public attention and inspiring extremist actors. As a result, many Christmas markets are now ringed with concrete blocks, armed police, and vehicle barriers to prevent attacks. However, with an estimated 3,000 markets across the country, many smaller ones almost certainly remain highly vulnerable, with only limited security measures in place. A successful Islamic State-inspired attack in Poland would likely have been a watershed moment for the country. Poland has previously foiled Islamist extremist plots and made related arrests, but it has never experienced a successful large-scale jihadist attack. Such an incident would almost certainly trigger heightened security measures and would likely carry significant political repercussions. This would be particularly acute in a country that has seen multiple large-scale anti-immigration protests, and where citizen patrols are currently policing the western border to prevent migrants from entering from Germany. The disrupted plots in Europe overlap with the Bondi attack in Australia on a Hanukkah celebration, highlighting the elevated threat during major religious festivals, when crowded public spaces become coveted targets for extremists seeking mass casualties and media attention. Two of the attacks have also been linked to Islamic State, indicating that despite sustained counter-terrorism pressure and territorial losses, the group still retains the ability to influence or coordinate attacks well beyond its primary area of operations. From there, we look at Ukraine, where talks in Berlin have focused on possible security guarantees and territorial concessions ahead of a proposed peace plan. Delegations from Ukraine, the US, and European allies met for 2 days of negotiations in Berlin on December 14th and 15th. Previous rounds of talks in recent weeks have highlighted two key issues: territorial concessions and security guarantees. And the US delegation is reportedly seeking to resolve these in order to prepare a proposal that can then be presented to Moscow. On security guarantees, the latest talks centered on the US and European allies offering a commitment similar to NATO's Article 5, which treats an attack on one member as an attack on all. On December 14th, President Volodymyr Zelensky stated that he is prepared to drop Ukraine's demand for NATO membership in exchange for legally binding and robust guarantees. On territorial concessions, the US delegation reportedly proposed that Ukraine withdraw from the remaining unoccupied parts of the Donbass, which would then become a demilitarized, free economic zone. Territory in other parts of Ukraine, including in Kherson and Zaporizhzhia oblasts, would be frozen at the current lines of control. Zelensky said he wanted a clearer understanding of how the security guarantees would work before making any decisions on territory. Now our intelligence team's assessment. The link between security guarantees and potential territorial concessions is significant, as reflected in Zelensky's wish for clarity on the guarantees before any decisions are made on territory. The remaining unoccupied portions of the Donbass in Donetsk Oblast include the so-called Fortress Belt, a line of highly defensible fortified cities and towns where Russian forces have had to expend enormous manpower to make only slow and limited advances. Given the threat of a Russian reinvasion, Kyiv would almost certainly be willing to withdraw Ukrainian forces from this area only if the security guarantees are credible enough to deter Moscow. The Kremlin has so far given no indication that it is willing to accept the original 28-point peace plan proposed in mid-November, drafted by Steve Witkoff and Kirill Dmitriev, which included multiple concessions deemed unacceptable by Kyiv. The subsequent negotiations between the US, Ukraine, and European allies have focused on resolving the issues that made the 28-point plan so contentious for Kyiv. However, following the Berlin talks, the Kremlin has signaled further intransigence on these issues. Russia's Deputy Foreign Minister, Sergei Ryabkov, made this clearest on December 15th in an interview. On security guarantees, Ryabkov reiterated that Russia is completely unwilling to accept the deployment of any NATO forces in Ukraine. Ukraine's European allies have proposed deploying forces from the so-called Coalition of the Willing as a means of guaranteeing Ukraine's security. However, it is highly unlikely that the Kremlin would ever countenance such an arrangement, given that most coalition members are either NATO states or NATO partner states, including Australia and Japan. On territory, Ryabkov reiterated that Russia is completely unwilling to accept any proposal that compromises its control over the 5 Ukrainian regions Moscow claims to have annexed. In addition to Crimea, which was declared annexed in 2014, Russia unilaterally announced the annexation of Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhzhia oblasts in September 2022. Because these fundamental divides remain unresolved, it is unlikely that Moscow will accept any imminent peace deal from the US, even if Washington is able to reach a finalized proposal with Kiev in the near future. Staying in the region, mass protests have spread across Romania following allegations of deep-rooted corruption within the judiciary. Since December 10th, large demonstrations have taken place in Bucharest and other major cities, including Cluj-Napoca, Iași, Timișoara, Craiova, Brașov, Sibiu, Constanța, and Galați, in response to claims of judicial corruption. The protests have centered on major public squares and key government buildings. What began with several hundred people on the first day grew to at least 10,000 in Bucharest by December 14th. After a lull on the 15th and 16th, protests resumed on December 17th. The protests began after a documentary, Captured Justice, aired on December 9th, exposing alleged deep-seated corruption, abuses of power, and political influence within Romania's judiciary. According to the filmmaker, senior judges and judicial institutions have been operating with undue influence and shielding powerful interests, undermining judicial independence. Protesters have called for reforms to the justice system to ensure independence from political influence. Their demands include amending justice laws, removing procedural loopholes that allow delays in high-profile cases, and strengthening safeguards against political interference. They have also urged the removal of key judicial figures perceived to be responsible for the alleged abuses, including Leah Savonea, the president of the High Court of Cassation and Justice. At least 500 magistrates, judges, and prosecutors have signed an open letter expressing solidarity with judges Laurențiu Beșu and Raluca Moroșanu, who have raised concerns about problems within the justice system. Now, our assessment. Judicial corruption has been a persistent problem in Romania. Although the European Commission placed the country's justice system under enhanced monitoring through the Cooperation and Verification Mechanism from 2007 to 2023, the momentum of anti-corruption investigations has weakened since that oversight was lifted. Criminal networks embedded within state institutions have enabled the unhindered operation of organized crime, with investigations revealing cases in which senior officials obstructed law enforcement efforts and were implicated in steering public contracts to companies linked to organized criminal groups. One of the key elements of alleged judicial corruption is the political influence over the judiciary, with political actors exerting influence over senior judicial appointments, prosecutorial priorities, and disciplinary proceedings against magistrates. This has enabled selective law enforcement, with politics influencing whether corruption cases are pursued or stalled. The airing of the documentary has almost certainly further degraded already low trust in the judicial system. Should reforms and resignations fail to materialize, further protests are highly likely. And in Syria, an ISIS gunman has carried out a rare and deadly attack on US personnel near Palmyra, underscoring ongoing security risks. On December 13th, 2 US soldiers and a US civilian interpreter were killed by a lone Islamic State in Iraq and Syria gunmen near Palmyra in Homs Governorate. 3 additional service members and 2 Syrian Internal Security Forces personnel were wounded. The US personnel were deployed as part of an anti-ISIS mission. The gunman attacked the patrol after it left a government security headquarters south of Palmyra before being killed by Syrian partner forces. On the 14th of December, the Syrian Interior Ministry announced the arrest of 5 suspects linked to the attack. Moreover, a Syrian official told international media that the perpetrator had joined Syria's internal security forces as a base security guard 2 months earlier, having been recently reassigned due to suspicions of ISIS affiliation. US President Donald Trump vowed retaliation, stating in a social media post that great harm will come to those who attacked US forces in Syria. On the 16th of December, the Syrian Interior Minister Anas Khattab chaired an expanded security meeting to assess the regional security situation following the Palmyra attack, attended by senior Syrian military officials and commanders. Now our team's assessment. Following the fall of the Assad regime in late 2024, ISIS has almost certainly sought to exploit the fluid security environment, and it continues to use the Syrian desert, the Bardia, where Palmyra is located, as its primary haven in Syria. ISIS is estimated to maintain up to 3,000 fighters across Iraq and Syria, though some assessments place the figure at roughly double that. There have also been reports of an agreement for Islamic State, Khorasan province, to redeploy a number of fighters to Syria, alongside efforts by ISIS to recruit disaffected militants and former jihadist foreign fighters, who were previously aligned with Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, the former Islamist rebel group that now leads Syria's transitional government. The ISIS attack against US personnel in Syria is rare, marking the first such incident since 2019. It comes after Syria's transitional government formally joined the US-led anti-ISIS coalition in November, a move that prompted high-profile Islamic State supporters to call for attacks against the government wherever possible. Syrian security forces have had to expand recruitment rapidly, and this has almost certainly increased the risk of infiltration by ISIS or its sympathizers. The Palmyra attack is likely intended, at least in part, to foster distrust between the US and Syrian authorities, at a time when joint anti-ISIS operations between US Central Command and Syrian security forces are already taking place and are likely to increase following Syria's entry into the coalition. Globally, the Islamic State provinces, with the highest number of fighters and the greatest operational freedom, are now in sub-Saharan Africa. Al-Naba, a key IS propaganda outlet published weekly, frequently reports on attacks in Africa, which account for roughly 90% of all IS attacks in 2025. However, its editorials remain fixated on developments in Syria, almost certainly reflecting the group's continued prioritization of its long-term goal, expanding its operations and ultimately re-establishing a caliphate in the Levant. Syria is attracting growing interest from international investors as US sanctions ease, with foreign business travelers and organizations increasingly entering the country as its economy reopens. However, ISIS almost certainly retains a desire to target foreign nationals, and IS-affiliated channels have specifically urged supporters to kill foreigners now traveling to Syria, who may be moving with minimal protection given the relatively improved security environment. This threat almost certainly underscores the continued need for comprehensive security measures for all travel to Syria. Now shifting to Asia-Pacific, fighting between Thailand and Cambodia has continued to escalate, with airstrikes, mass displacement, and growing humanitarian strain along the border. Clashes have persisted along the Thai-Cambodian frontier, with both sides reporting military and civilian casualties. On December 16th, Cambodian authorities stated that the civilian death toll had reached 17, with nearly 440,000 people displaced. In Thailand, at least 21 people have been killed. Thai military sources reported several exchanges of fire, including airstrikes by F-16 fighter jets in Cambodia's Pursat and Bantay Menchi provinces, as well as artillery duels across multiple border areas. Cambodian officials accused Thailand of targeting civilian infrastructure, including bridges and homes, and reported Thai airstrikes deep inside Cambodian territory near refugee camps in Siem Reap province on December 15th. Cambodia's Ministry of Defense has also claimed that the Thai military is using toxic gas, violating international humanitarian law. On December 18th, Thai F-16s conducted airstrikes against targets in Phoi Phet, Cambodia's fourth-largest city, a major transport hub and the main border crossing with Thailand, also known for its casinos. That same day, the Thai military stated that clashes had taken place at several points along the international border overnight, and that they had seized territory in Ubon Ratchathani province while preventing a Cambodian incursion in Surin province. Both countries have reported significant military casualties. The Thai army said that at least 4 soldiers were killed on December 13th in the Chongan Ma region, with additional deaths reported in the days that followed. The Thai military also claimed to have taken control of disputed areas, including the Prasat Takwai temple near the Surin-Odar-Menchi border. Evacuation orders were issued for residents in Thailand's Khun Han district in Sisa Ket province on December 15th, while curfews were imposed, and later lifted, in several districts in Trat province. Cambodia announced a full suspension of cross-border travel on December 13th. The Association of Southeast Asian Nations and Malaysian officials called for a ceasefire, which Thailand refused to accept, insisting that it would continue military actions to defend its sovereignty. On December 14th, Thailand's military command announced a naval blockade on Cambodia to prevent Thai fishing boats, oil tankers, and other vessels from reaching the Cambodian mainland. The Royal Thai Navy stated that the measure would not amount to a full blockade and would not target vessels from other countries. The Ministry of Defense is preparing a list of supplies that will be subject to the restrictions. On December 15th, Thailand's military cut off fuel shipments transiting via Laos after receiving intelligence suggesting that supplies were being diverted to Cambodian forces. Diplomatic efforts included calls from US President Donald Trump, who claimed on December 12th that a ceasefire had been agreed, though Thailand rejected this. ASEAN announced plans to deploy an observer team to monitor the situation, but reports of heavy fighting and continued airstrikes persisted throughout the week. Now, our intelligence assessment. Several civilian areas have been targeted by both sides, significantly increasing the risk of escalating tit-for-tat strikes. Cambodia's Interior Ministry has stated that at least 4 casinos have been damaged by Thai strikes, but Thailand's bombing of Phoi Phet, a major city and casino hub popular with Thai and foreign gamblers, almost certainly marks an escalation. Thailand has claimed that the casinos constitute legitimate military targets, alleging that they are being used to stage troops, launch drones, and store rockets for BM-21 multi-barrel rocket launchers. However, many of these casinos are also hubs for large-scale online scamming and human trafficking operations, and it is highly likely that Thailand is deliberately targeting these scam centers. The targeting of casinos almost certainly increases the risk of collateral civilian harm and raises the likelihood that Cambodia will increasingly strike civilian infrastructure, such as hospitals or supermarkets. The clashes have severely affected hospitals along the border. According to the Thai military and public health officials, around 200 local Thai health facilities, including 10 hospitals, have closed after Cambodian rockets landed close to civilian areas. Routine medical services have been disrupted, and many displaced people are struggling to access healthcare, a situation that will almost certainly increase pressure on the hospitals that remain open in the border regions. This strain is likely exacerbated by high levels of civilian displacement, which have almost certainly led to overcrowded shelters and a heightened risk of communicable disease. In addition, the border closures almost certainly hinder cross-border referral networks and supply chains for medicines and other essential supplies. Thailand's naval blockade is likely to lead to prolonged fuel shortages in Cambodia, triggering price increases, wider shortages, and possible power cuts. Neighboring countries such as Laos are also likely to be indirectly affected. This will highly likely worsen the cost of living for many people and could spark protests in major cities. Such unrest would almost certainly increase pressure on Cambodia's government to negotiate another ceasefire with Thailand. President Trump's claim of a ceasefire was almost certainly intended to provide a potential off-ramp for both sides. However, Thailand's rejection of that claim, along with its pledges to protect Thai's sovereignty, demonstrates that it is highly likely Thailand will not de-escalate without concrete mechanisms in place. Without a long-term peace framework, renewed clashes are likely to continue until at least the Thai election in February 2026. And finally, in the region, Australia is responding to a mass casualty terrorist attack at a Hanukkah celebration in Sydney's Bondi Beach. On the evening of December 14th, the first night of the 2025 Hanukkah festival, 2 gunmen opened fire at a large public celebration called Chanukah by the Sea at Sydney's Bondi Beach. Around 1,000 people were attending the event. 16 deaths have been reported, including one of the gunmen, along with more than 40 injuries. The incident has been declared a terrorist attack by the authorities. The perpetrators have been identified as a father and son, Sajid Akram and Naveed Akram. The attack began with the pair opening fire from a bridge towards Archer Park. One of the gunmen, believed to be Sajid Akram, then moved down into the park, where he was disarmed by a member of the public before returning to the bridge. Following a firefight with responding police, both attackers were neutralized, with one dying at the scene. A total of 6 firearms and 3 improvised explosive devices were found at the scene and at 2 homes in Bonnyrigg and Campsie. Sajid Akram was a licensed gun owner through his membership of a gun club, and all 6 firearms are believed to have been legally acquired. Now, our intelligence team's assessment. The Bondi Beach mass shooting is the deadliest terrorist attack in Australian history, and the deadliest mass shooting since the 1996 Port Arthur massacre. The attack was almost certainly linked to Islamic State, either through inspiration or more direct coordination. Investigators from the Australian Joint Counter-Terrorism Team believe the 2 perpetrators had pledged allegiance to IS, and 2 IS flags were found in their vehicle at Bondi Beach. The Australian Security Intelligence Organisation reportedly took interest in one of the perpetrators, Naveed Akram, 6 years ago, due to his ties to a Sydney-based Islamic State cell. This followed the July 2019 arrest of Isaac El-Matari, the self-proclaimed head of IS in Australia, who had sought to establish an insurgency in the country. According to a senior Joint Counter-Terrorism Team official, Naveed Akram was closely connected to El-Matari. These findings strongly suggest at least a historical connection to an Australian IS cell. However, Prime Minister Anthony Albanese has stated that intelligence authorities have informed him that there is no evidence of collusion and no evidence that these people were part of a cell. In November, the 2 perpetrators travelled to Mindanao in the Philippines, returning to Australia just over 2 weeks before the attack. The purpose of the trip remains under investigation, but a senior Australian counter-terrorism official stated that Naveed and Sajid Akram received military-style training while there. IS-affiliated cells remain active in Mindanao, despite being significantly degraded since the 2017 siege of Marawi. In 2025, Philippine security forces reportedly arrested 75 militants linked to the Bangsamoro Islamic freedom fighters, underscoring their continued presence. Several other jihadist groups in the region have also pledged allegiance to IS, forming the Islamic State, Philippines province. Philippine police have attempted to dismiss claims that the suspects received training in Mindanao, stating that the pair rarely left their hotel for more than an hour at a time. However, the police are almost certainly incentivized to downplay the continued presence of IS-affiliated cells in the region. In apparent contrast to the attribution to IS, Israeli intelligence sources have briefed that the attack may have been carried out with the support of Iran or Iran-backed actors such as Hezbollah. In August 2025, Iran's ambassador to Australia, Ahmad Sadeghi, was expelled following credible evidence that a series of anti-Semitic attacks, including an arson attack on a cafe in Sydney in October 2024 and on a synagogue in Melbourne in December 2024, had been orchestrated by Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. More broadly, the number of anti-Semitic attacks in Australia has risen sharply over the past 2 years, with the Executive Council of Australian Jewry recording levels almost 5 times the average annual number before, October 2023. The Bondi beach terrorist attack underscores the almost certainly elevated risk of terrorism in Western countries, particularly against targets associated with Judaism. Other attacks in 2025 include the October ramming and stabbing assault targeting Jewish worshippers at a synagogue in Manchester during Yom Kippur, and the May shooting near the Capitol Jewish Museum in Washington, D.C. In addition to the elevated risk of anti-Semitic terrorism against targets such as synagogues, Jewish schools, and Hanukkah gatherings, running this year from December 14th to December 22nd. The winter holiday season almost certainly brings an increased threat to soft targets more broadly. Symbolic and high-visibility events, including Christmas markets, draw large crowds and are difficult to protect comprehensively. In the aftermath of the Bondi beach attack, security at Hanukkah events and synagogues is almost certain to be heightened, as has already been reported in cities such as Berlin, London, and New York. That concludes this week's Global Intelligence Briefing. These updates are part of our Global Intelligence subscription, which includes weekly reports, in-depth briefings, and live Q&A sessions with our experts. To learn more, visit solisglobal.com. Thank you for listening.